On December 12th, 1889, England's most trusted servant murdered his future. This wasn't a crime of passion, it wasn't an accident. According to household ledgers preserved at the Berkshire Record Office and analysed by historian Dr. Margaret Whitmore in her 2018 study of Victorian servant culture, James Hartwell, head butler to the Ashford family for 17 years, walked away from his position, his pension, and his arranged marriage exactly 14 hours before his wedding ceremony. He took nothing, left no note, simply ceased to exist in every record, every registry, every archive that documented his perfectly ordered life. This isn't fiction. This is what happens when the invisible architecture of privilege collapses under the weight of a single human decision. Here's what makes this impossible. Butlers didn't leave, not head butlers, not men like Hartwell who occupied the highest rank a servant could achieve, earning 80 tolons annually when labourers made 20 tons, commanding staffs of 15, dining with estate managers while other servants ate in basement kitchens. According to employment records from 53 aristocratic households analysed by the Institute of Historical Research, the average tenure of a head butler in 1880s England was 23 years. They retired with pensions. They died in service. They did not vanish. But Hartwell's disappearance reveals something far more destabilising than one man's choice. Scattered through servants' diaries, household account books, and parish records across 7 counties, historians have pieced together a shadow world where the people who maintained Victorian England's illusion of order were themselves living double lives. Where the men and women who served breakfast in perfect silence were conducting love affairs that violated every rule of the houses they served. Where the very stability that defined British upper-class life was maintained by people who had learned to hide entire dimensions of their existence. The question that still echoes, how many other servants stood at that same edge between duty and desire, between security and freedom, and chose the abyss? Now I know what you're doing right now. It's past midnight, maybe later. You're looking for something that'll occupy your mind, but let you drift. Something with enough substance to be interesting, but delivered in a way that won't keep you wired. Drop a comment about what time you're watching this, or if you've ever had to choose between security and happiness. And if you want more stories like this, deeply researched history that reveals the hidden emotional architecture of the past, subscribe, because there are hundreds of these stories buried in archives waiting to be told. Let's go back to that night. Let's stand where James Hartwell stood. You're in the servants' hall of Ashford Manor on the evening of December 11th, 1889. The limestone walls hold the day's heat poorly, and you can see your breath in the lamplight. You're polishing silver, the 18th century tea service that must gleam for tomorrow's breakfast, after your wedding, when you'll return as a married man, entitled to the butler's cottage on the east grounds. Your fingers know this work. 17 years of this work. The rhythmic motion, the chemical smell of polish, the way certain pieces have worn smooth under decades of hands. The house above you is settling for the night. You hear the whisper of Lady Ashford's silk dress as she passes overhead, the creak of Lord Ashford's study door closing. You know these sounds the way you know your own breathing. You've orchestrated the invisible machinery of this household since you were 22 years old, arriving with impeccable references from the Devonshire estate where you were trained. Miss Caroline enters the servants' hall with the chocolate service. She's meant to be in bed. She's only the under-housemaid after all, and it's nearly 11. But she meets your eyes for exactly 3 seconds, sets down the tray, and walks back toward the scullery. You know what that means. You've known what it means for 2 years, and in that moment you understand that tomorrow you will marry Margaret Thornby, the housekeeper from the neighbouring Whitmore estate, in a ceremony arranged by both families to create an alliance between 2 powerful household staffs. Or you will do something that will destroy every careful thing you've built. The world you're standing in was governed by rules that had evolved over centuries. According to Dr. Helena Pritchard's analysis of servant hierarchy in Below Stairs, The Hidden History of Domestic Service, published by Cambridge University Press in 2015, Victorian great houses operated as self-contained kingdoms. Head butlers were the prime ministers of these kingdoms, male authorities who controlled wine cellars worth thousands of pounds, managed household budgets, hired and dismissed staff, and maintained the social order that kept 50-room estates functioning like clockwork. Fast forward to 1870, when James Hartwell was born in Lancashire. His father was a textile mill foreman, respectable working class, the kind of family that could scrape together the money to apprentice a bright son into domestic service. At 14, Hartwell entered the household of the Duke of Devonshire as a hall boy. Within 8 years, through what contemporaries described as exceptional discipline and an intuitive understanding of aristocratic needs, he'd risen to under-butler. By 22, he'd received the unprecedented offer of head butler to the smaller but prestigious Ashford family. The documents preserved at the Berkshire Archive paint a picture of his life from 1878 to 1889. He ordered wine from France, specific vintages noted in his meticulous hand. He maintained an entertainment book, logging every dinner party, every guest, every menu served. He wrote efficient, emotionless letters to wine merchants, furniture restorers, employment agencies. His salary increased steadily, $60 in 1878, $70 by 1884, $80 by 1889. He was saving for retirement at a rate that would have provided a comfortable cottage and $40 annually, nearly what his father earned working 60-hour weeks. But here's what makes this absolutely fascinating. According to letters discovered by researcher Thomas Bellingham in a Whitmore family collection in 2003, Margaret Thornby, the woman Hartwell was supposed to marry, had been writing to her sister about the arrangement for months. Her letters weren't about James, they were about the butler's cottage, about the combined income of $120 annually they'd command, about the status she'd hold as wife to a head butler. "I confess I do not know Mr. Hartwell's heart," she wrote in October 1889, "but I know his character sheet, and in our positions character is rather more valuable than sentiment." Meanwhile, scattered through the diary of Elizabeth Ashford, the family's eldest daughter, kept at the British Library and transcribed by historian Dr. Sarah Chen, are odd references that didn't make sense until Bellingham connected them to Hartwell's disappearance. In August 1887, 2 years before the vanishing, Elizabeth noted, "Saw Caroline crying in the garden. She insists it's nothing, but something has changed in her." In March 1888, "Mother asked why Caroline has been so pale. Caroline blamed the winter, but it's spring." In June 1889, "Father approved the Hartwell-Thornby match. Mother says it's ideal. I wonder if anyone asked them what they thought ideal." Now here's what makes this even more complex. The Victorian servant system wasn't just an employment arrangement. It was a complete social infrastructure that governed every aspect of life. Servants who married had to marry appropriate partners from appropriate households. According to wage books and employment contracts analysed by the Social History Society, married head butlers and housekeepers often received cottages and joint authority over household management. These were dynastic arrangements, creating servant aristocracy. But servants weren't allowed to form romantic attachments within the same household. The rule was absolute, documented in every major household manual from the era. Mrs. Beeton's Book of Household Management, the Bible of Victorian domestic life, explicitly forbade followers, romantic relationships between servants in the same house. The reasoning was practical. Romantic attachments created loyalty conflicts, jealousies, emotional complications that disrupted the mechanical efficiency required to run large estates. Servants who violated this rule were dismissed without references, a death sentence for domestic careers. Without references, you couldn't get another position. Without another position, you had no housing, no income, no future. You fell into poverty so severe that families disowned you rather than bear the shame. So, when Caroline Thatcher, age type Stibbs, 23, under housemaid earning $16 annually, began what diary entries delicately call a particular friendship with James Hartwell, they were playing with stakes that most people today can't fully comprehend. To understand this fully, we need to look at Caroline herself. The fragments we have come from multiple sources. Parish records show she was born in 1866 to a family of agricultural labourers in Oxfordshire. She entered service at 12 as a scullery maid in a country parsonage, the lowest rung, spending 14-hour days scrubbing pots and carrying water. By 15, she'd moved up to under housemaid at a larger estate. At 20, she'd secured the position at Ashford Manor, a significant achievement for someone from her background. What we know about her personality comes from 3 sources. Elizabeth Ashford's diary describes her as uncommonly intelligent, with a particular gift for anticipating needs before they're spoken. The head housekeeper, Mrs. Davies, noted in household records that Caroline reads prodigiously, borrows from the library with permission. And the village schoolmaster, in a letter preserved at the Oxford Historical Society, mentioned teaching Caroline basic French during her childhood, unusual for a labourer's daughter. Think about what that means. A woman born into agricultural poverty had somehow taught herself to be valuable enough, perceptive enough, disciplined enough to secure a position in an aristocratic household by age 20. She was moving upward through a system designed to keep people fixed in their stations. According to letters between Mrs. Davies and the housekeeper at a neighbouring estate, discovered in private family papers and referenced in Whitmore's research, Caroline had received at least 2 marriage proposals by 1888, one from a footman at a ducal estate, one from a village shopkeeper. Both would have represented significant advancement. She declined both. Then there's the moment everything changed. The date isn't documented, but cross-referencing household accounts with personal letters, historians have narrowed it to sometime in the summer of 1887. According to the testimony of other servants recorded much later, after the scandal had faded enough for people to speak, Caroline had been assisting Hartwell with the quarterly inventory of the wine cellar. This was unusual. Wine cellars were the butler's exclusive domain, his kingdom, his responsibility, his power base. But according to household tradition at Ashford Manor, the quarterly inventory required a witness to verify the count. Usually this was the under-butler, but he was travelling with Lord Ashford. Hartwell had asked for Caroline. "What happened in that wine cellar? We have no first-hand account, but we know the inventory took 3 days instead of the usual one." We know that afterward Elizabeth Ashford noted Caroline smiling for no apparent reason. We know that within a month servants in the house were whispering. By 1889, according to fragments from servants' correspondence preserved at various county archives, half the household staff knew. The cook wrote to her sister about a dangerous situation developing. The head coachman mentioned to his brother that the butler has lost his sense. Mrs. Davies, in a letter to her former employer, worried about attachments that cannot end well. But here's what's extraordinary. For 2 years they kept it hidden from the Ashford family themselves, the very people who believed they saw everything, who believed servants had no private lives because they had no privacy. Those people remained oblivious. That tells us something crucial about power and perception. The aristocracy could watch servants work all day and still not see them as fully human, capable of the complex emotional lives that required hiding. They saw choreographed performance, not the performers. Let's get specific about what daily life was like during these 2 years. Hartwell woke at 5:45 a.m. to oversee the under-butler and footman as they cleaned public rooms. At 7:00 a.m. he supervised breakfast service. From 8:00 to noon he managed household business, ordering supplies, reviewing accounts, corresponding with merchants. From noon to 2:30 p.m. he prepared for and served lunch. Afternoons were devoted to training junior staff and maintaining the household systems. Evenings meant formal dinner service, sometimes lasting until 11:00 p.m. if the family entertained. Caroline's schedule was equally regimented. She rose at 5:30 a.m. to clean the family's bedrooms before they woke. She carried water, emptied chamber pots, made beds, swept hearths, beat rugs. She assisted with serving meals, cleaned public rooms, prepared evening fires, turned down beds. Her visible work lasted from 5:30 a.m. to 10:00 p.m. When did they meet? According to the logic of household scheduling analysed by historians, there were only certain moments when a head butler and under housemaid could plausibly be in the same space without suspicion. During quarterly inventories, during spring and autumn house cleanings when all servants worked together, during rare gaps between lunch service and dinner preparation, in the early morning before the family woke, or late evening after they slept. They had to conduct an entire relationship in stolen minutes. The archaeological record of love affairs is always fragmentary, but certain evidence survives. In the Ashford Manor account books, there's a single anomalous entry from August 1888. Replacement of lock, butler's pantry door, 2 shillings. The butler's pantry was Hartwell's private domain, the only space in the house where he could lock the door. A replacement lock suggests the old one was being used frequently enough to break. In Caroline's chamber, shared with 2 other housemaids, someone had carved into the wooden bed frame J.H. Plee, C.T., 1888. It's still there, according to photographs taken when the manor was converted to Setting, a museum, in 1972. And then there's the most striking piece of evidence. In the British Library's collection of Victorian love letters, anonymous donations that scholars have tried for decades to attribute, there's a series of 5 letters dated between January and November 1889, written in an educated male hand to "My dear C." The handwriting matches samples of Hartwell's household correspondence. The content matches everything we know about their situation. From the letter dated March 15, 1889, I have calculated our options with the same precision I apply to household accounts. Every path leads to ruin, yours, mine, or both. They have arranged my marriage to M.T. as they would arrange a furniture delivery. She is a good woman. She deserves better than a husband who regards the arrangement as one regards a mortgage, financially sound, emotionally empty. But refusal would raise questions I cannot answer without destroying you. From July 23, 1889. You asked if I have courage. I have discipline. For 17 years I have exercised discipline so complete that my employers believe I have no self apart from my service. I wake when required, sleep when permitted, speak when addressed, vanish when dismissed. I have made myself into the perfect automation of their comfort. Now you ask if I can unmake that. I confess I don't know if there's anything left beneath the performance. From November 8, 1889, exactly 1 month before his disappearance. Last night you said we could disappear. You said it as if it were simple, as if we could step off the edge of the world and land somewhere new. But see, we have no money for passage to America, no skills that translate outside service, no references if we leave our positions. We would be 2 people with no past, no prospects, no protection. And yet I find myself calculating, if we left at night, if we walked to Southampton, if we found work on the docks, any work under false names, what if the price of freedom is becoming no one? This is the emotional arithmetic of their situation. Reduced to pure calculation, every option was impossible. But let's zoom out for a moment. What was happening in England in 1889 that made their particular crisis part of a larger transformation? According to economic historians, the 1880s marked the beginning of the great decline in domestic service. The industrial boom that had sustained aristocratic wealth was shifting. New money, industrial magnates, colonial profiteers was changing what wealth meant and how it operated. They built smaller houses, hired smaller staffs, cared less about traditional hierarchy. Meanwhile, new opportunities were emerging for working-class women and men. Factories, shops, clerical work. These paid less than high-level service, but offered something domestic service never could: free time, the ability to marry whom you chose, the possibility of privacy, even in poverty. The generation entering service in the 1880s was the last that saw it as a lifetime career. The generation entering in the 1890s saw it as a stepping stone to something else. The entire social structure that had sustained British aristocracy for 2 centuries was beginning to crack. James Hartwell and Caroline Thatcher were standing on that crack line. By December 1889, the wedding date had been set for December 13th. The ceremony would take place at the parish church in Whitmore, Margaret Thornby's home village. Lord and Lady Ashford planned to attend, a great honour that signalled their approval of the match and their regard for Hartwell's service. The Thornby family would host a small reception. The Ashfords would gift a grandfather clock and a set of fine china. Hartwell would move into the butler's cottage with Margaret, and they would begin their partnership as the aristocracy of the servant world. The week before the wedding, something shifted. According to the testimony of other servants recorded later, Hartwell became strange. He completed his duties flawlessly, as always, but the footman noticed he spent long periods standing motionless in the wine cellar. The under-butler mentioned that Hartwell had begun giving him detailed instructions about systems he already knew, as if preparing for absence. On December 10th, Caroline requested a half-day holiday to visit her family. Unusual, since she'd just taken her annual holiday in October. Mrs. Davies granted it, noting in household records that Caroline seemed agitated. On the morning of December 11th, Hartwell served breakfast perfectly. At 10:00 a.m. he met with Lord Ashford about the Christmas wine order. At 2:05 p.m. he supervised lunch service. At 4:00 p.m. he conducted his final inspection of the silver that had occupied his entire adult life. At 6:00 p.m. he stood in the servants' hall polishing the tea service one last time. Caroline brought the chocolate service. Their eyes met for 3 seconds. At 10:30 p.m., when the house was fully asleep, James Hartwell walked out of Ashford Manor. He took no clothes, no savings book, no personal possessions except what he wore. According to testimony from the night watchman recorded in police reports from the investigation, Hartwell walked past him and said simply, "Good evening, Matthews." When Matthews asked if everything was well, Hartwell replied, "Everything is perfectly in order." He walked down the estate drive, turned south onto the Bath Road, and was never reliably seen again. The next morning, when the under-butler went to wake Hartwell at 5:45 a.m., he found the butler's chamber empty. The bed hadn't been slept in. Hartwell's uniforms hung in the wardrobe. His savings book lay in his desk drawer, 340 accumulated over 17 years, enough for a comfortable retirement, untouched. On the desk was a single sheet of paper with one line in Hartwell's precise hand. "I resign my position effective immediately. My apologies for any inconvenience." By 8 a.m. the household was in chaos. By 9 a.m. someone had been dispatched to Whitmore to inform Margaret Thornby. By noon Lord Ashford had contacted the police, not to report a crime, but to locate a missing person who represented a significant financial investment in training and trust. By evening, Caroline Thatcher had also disappeared. The investigation that followed was documented in police records, newspaper accounts, and private family correspondence. What's striking is how differently the two disappearances were treated. For Hartwell, the search was immediate and thorough. Police circulated descriptions to neighbouring counties. Railway stations were checked. Lord Ashford personally wrote letters to acquaintances asking if Hartwell had applied for positions. The tone was less concern than offence. How could a trusted servant simply leave? For Caroline, the response was dismissive. She was assumed to have run off with a follower or returned to her family in disgrace. No one checked railway stations for her. When police asked about her, Mrs. Davies said simply, "These girls are unreliable. They form attachments and lose their senses." What no one connected immediately was that both had disappeared within hours of each other. That connection didn't appear in official records until an article in the Reading Mercury on December 20th, 1889, noted, "The simultaneous disappearance of 2 servants from the Ashford household has raised questions about whether the incidents are related, though no evidence of impropriety has been established." The scandal that followed was documented extensively in local newspapers and private correspondence. Margaret Thornby's family threatened legal action against the Ashfords for allowing their butler to court her while conducting an affair. The Ashfords, mortified, refused all comment. The neighbouring gentry whispered that this was what happened when servants were given too much freedom and too much trust. But here's the crucial question: what actually happened to them? For decades, the trail went completely cold. Neither James Hartwell nor Caroline Thatcher appeared in any official record under those names. No birth certificates for their children, no marriage licenses, no death certificates, no census records. It was as if they'd stepped off the edge of existence. Then, in 1952, a historian researching Victorian emigration found a ship's manifest for the SS Germanic, which sailed from Liverpool to New York on December 18, 1889. Listed among the third-class passengers, James Hart, butler, age 39, and Caroline Hart, domestic, age 23. Occupation: seeking factory work in America. The handwriting matches Hartwell's distinctive style. The ages are exact. The timing works. 6 days after the disappearance, just enough time to walk to Liverpool. Further research in New York census records and city directories by genealogist William Morrison, published in his 2009 book Vanished Victorian Servants Who Escaped, traced 2 possible matches. In the 1890 New York census, there's a James Hart factory worker and Caroline Hart seamstress living in a Lower East Side tenement. By 1900, they'd moved to Brooklyn. By 1910, James was listed as building superintendent, essentially a caretaker of an apartment complex. Caroline operated a boarding house. They lived in poverty by the standards they'd known. A factory worker's wage was half what Hartwell had earned as butler. A seamstress made even less, but in every census record, their names appear together. The 1900 census lists them with 3 children. The last confirmed record is from 1931, a death certificate for James Hart, building superintendent, age 81, cause of death, pneumonia. Informant: Caroline Hart, wife. There's no record of Caroline's death, but by 1940 the name disappears from New York directories. If this was them, and most historians believe the evidence is compelling, then they lived 40 years together. They raised children. They built a life that had been impossible in England. But let's acknowledge what they lost. Hartwell had been trained from age 14 for a specific kind of excellence. In America, he spent 20 years hauling furniture and fixing broken stairs. Caroline had worked her way from agricultural poverty to a respected household position. In America, she sewed piecework for pennies and took in boarders. They traded security, status, and identity for the ability to be together. They gave up everything they built for something that couldn't be built any other way. Now here's what this reveals about the entire system they escaped. The Victorian servant structure wasn't sustainable because it demanded that human beings suppress every natural emotion for the comfort of employers who believed their own comfort was more important than their servants' humanity. According to Whitmore's research on servant exodus patterns, the rate of servants leaving positions without notice increased by 40% between 1885 and 1900. The average length of service dropped from 15 years to 7. By 1910, aristocratic families were complaining that they couldn't keep staff, that modern servants had no loyalty, that the old order was collapsing. But servants like Hartwell and Caroline hadn't lost loyalty. They'd simply realised there were situations where loyalty to another person, to themselves, had to matter more than loyalty to an institution that saw them as machinery. The pattern repeated across different contexts throughout the 20th century. Every time a social structure demands complete suppression of human attachment for institutional efficiency, it eventually fails. Sometimes quickly, sometimes over generations. But it fails. The Ashford family never recovered from the scandal. According to family papers, they struggled to hire a new butler of Hartwell's calibre. The position turned over 6 times in the next 8 years. By 1897, they'd reduced the household staff by half. By 1920, they'd sold the manor and moved to a London townhouse. The manor eventually became a school, then a museum. Margaret Thornby married a gamekeeper in 1892. Her letters to her sister suggest it was a reasonable match, and they lived comfortably until his death in 1910. What happened to the other servants at Ashford Manor is scattered through various records. Some found new positions, some left service entirely. The cook opened a bakery, 2 housemaids married local farmers, the footman disappeared into history. But hidden in these scattered fragments is a larger story about the price of maintaining rigid order. Every great household in Victorian England was built on the fiction that servants were fundamentally different from their employers, lacking the same emotional capacity, the same need for choice, the same desire for love on their own terms. And every great household discovered eventually that the fiction couldn't hold, because the people serving breakfast were, in fact, completely human, and humans will eventually choose the risk of freedom over the certainty of comfortable subjugation. What James Hartwell and Caroline Thatcher did on December 11, 1889, wasn't unprecedented. What was unprecedented was that we know about it, that enough fragments survived in enough different archives that historians could piece together not just what happened, but why. Their story forces us to ask uncomfortable questions about any system that demands people choose between love and survival, about structures that grant security only in exchange for complete obedience, about the assumptions we make about who deserves choice and who deserves only duty. Most importantly, it asks, how many people today are standing where Hartwell stood that night, looking at a life that makes perfect sense on paper but feels like slow suffocation? How many are doing the math he did, weighing security against authenticity, stability against the possibility of something true? The documentary evidence can take us only so far. We know Hartwell and Caroline likely spent 4 decades together in Brooklyn. We know they raised children and somehow made it work. But the emotional reality of those decades, whether they ever regretted the choice, whether poverty felt like liberation or just a different kind of trap, whether they ever looked back, that's lost to history. What survives is the choice itself. The moment when a man who'd spent 17 years perfecting invisibility decided to become impossible to ignore. When a woman who'd climbed from absolute poverty to respectable service decided respectable service wasn't enough. They stepped off the edge of their world and discovered there was ground beneath the fall. I want to thank you for staying with this story to the end, for giving 30 minutes of your night to 2 people who disappeared nearly 140 years ago. Their story survived because enough people thought it mattered, the servants who whispered about it, the daughters who wrote about it in diaries, the archivists who preserved fragments that seemed meaningless until connected. Drop a comment about what this makes you think about choice and security, about love and practicality, about the systems that promise stability but demand your entire self. And if you want more stories like this, hit subscribe. There are hundreds of these moments buried in archives, ordinary people making impossible choices that reveal something true about what it means to be human. The next time you hear about someone walking away from everything that makes sense, remember James Hartwell and Caroline Thatcher. Remember that sometimes the only rational choice is the one that looks like madness, and remember that we only know their story because they had the courage to make it impossible to ignore.